But welcome to 2024. Welcome to the Igbo and Yoruba Speaking with One Voice 2024 edition. We must remind ourselves as to why we host this event every year. And I start with the quotation from the great Odumegwu Ojukwu himself in his book, Because I Am Involved. He said, "I am humbly of the opinion that the true beginnings of our loss of direction as a nation can be traced directly to the fabrication and installation of what I had earlier called East-West dichotomy." That was Ojukwu. He was not to be outdone because in the book, The Trial of Obafemi Awolowo, we come across these words from the Western sage. He said, "I hold it as a fact that if the Action Group and the NCNC," and it would be recalled the Action Group was the political vessel of the Western region, and NCNC was the political vessel of the Eastern region. If the Action Group and the NCNC, both of which parties have a monopoly of political following in the South, and at least 1/3 of the political followership in the North, could come together, then they would infinitely increase the tempo of progress in the Federation as a whole. The Yoruba and Igbo Conference is organized by the Fatherland Group with the aim of improving relations between these two major ethnic groups for the betterment of all Nigerians, in the belief that if the fractured relationship between these two can be understood, it can then be repaired for the betterment of all ethnic groups in Nigeria. This conference is the 4th in the series. The program for this year is shaped by what we all witnessed in the media wars for the elections that took place last year, 2023. But let's start at the beginning, when Nigeria was made, and these two nations who shared no borders and who were separated by the great river Niger and who previously had very little interaction with one another were brought together by the British. Bonnie at this point will play the video that will carry us from the beginning, 1900 to 1939, and then I will return. Bonnie, over to you.
With the second highest death toll of all African conflicts, the Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Biafran War, is perhaps the single most significant event in Nigerian history. This 3-year conflict, which raged on from the 6th of July 1967 till the 15th of January 1970, would claim the lives of over 100,000 soldiers and an estimated 2 million civilians, as the Nigerian government, led by General Yakubu Gowon, fought to prevent the secession of the self-proclaimed Republic of Biafra, which was led by General Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu. To fully understand the root cause of this brutal conflict, we need to go all the way back to the very beginning. Upon gaining independence from Great Britain in 1960, the newly formed Nigerian Republic was greatly divided, as its 3 largest ethnic groups struggled to live in harmony. Beyond the more obvious distinctions like language, clothing, and marriage customs, Nigeria's 3 main ethnic groups also had fundamental differences in values and worldviews which had been developed over the many centuries leading up to the colonial era and the formation of the Nigerian state. The Igbos, who represented about 60 to 70% of the population of the southeast, were mostly Christians who in the centuries before the colonial era had lived in relatively egalitarian societies. Although most Igbo towns and villages were headed by monarchs known as Ezes, the political decision-making process within Igbo communities was actually quite democratic, as it involved general assemblies composed of title holders and other respected members of Igbo society. Status was acquired through one's ability to solve societal issues, and respect was given primarily to those who had acquired wealth, as opposed to those who had simply inherited it. The character of Okonkwo in the book Things Fall Apart by renowned Nigerian author Chinua Achebe was in many ways the perfect illustration of the uniquely Igbo vision of the self-made man. The Igbo's particular appreciation for wealth creation through hard work is undoubtedly the main reason why many of Nigeria's champions of industry have been of Igbo ancestry. By contrast, the majority Muslim Hausa Fulani, which represented about 65% of the northern population, had lived for many years in feudal societies in which large working-class populations were ruled by a small theocratic elite composed of emirs and sultans. As their political leaders often doubled as religious leaders, compliance and submission to the will of the political establishment was not simply a civic duty, but a religious one. Very much unlike in Igbo societies, there was nothing particularly odd or shameful about a man aspiring to live a modest life as a farm worker, craftsman, or a nomadic cattle herder. But contrary to commonly held prejudices, the Hausa Fulani were not in any way lazier or inherently less enterprising than their southern counterparts. They simply had a deeper appreciation for religious discipline and had a more socially conservative worldview. However, there is no denying the fact that while the unquestioning submissiveness of northern societies to the theocratic establishment guaranteed internal stability and order, it also meant that the north was a lot less economically vibrant. Northerners were generally less open to new ideas and often completely rejected secular education in favor of Islamic education. Demonstrating the extent of Nigeria's north-south divide, some studies estimated that as at Nigeria's independence in 1960, northern Nigeria had an English literacy rate of just 2%, compared to the southeast, which had an English literacy rate of 19.2%. The Yorubas, which formed about 75% of Nigeria's southwestern population, were in many ways a sort of halfway house between the Igbos and the Hausa Fulani, both in terms of their religious affiliation and their political history. Although also majority Christian, they nevertheless had significant populations of Muslims as well as followers of the ancient Yoruba religions. In simple terms, the traditional Yoruba political structure was basically less autocratic than the Hausa Fulani, but not as democratic as the Igbo. For centuries, Yoruba societies were ruled by kings known as Obas, who governed in close consultation with chiefs, priests, and priestesses. Culturally, the Yorubas were quite similar to the Igbo in their appreciation for individual drive and ambition. However, the Yorubas tended to channel their energies towards excellence in the arts and academia, as opposed to pure industry and wealth creation. Many often point to the Yorubas' deep appreciation of the arts as the reason why many of Nigeria's most prominent cultural icons, such as Afrobeat legend Fela Kuti and the Nobel Prize laureate Professor Wole Soyinka, have been of Yoruba ancestry. But to say that the differences between Nigeria's three main tribes meant that every Igbo, Yoruba, or Hausa Fulani person hated anyone who wasn't from their tribe would be very far from the truth. In reality, most Yoruba societies got on well enough with Igbo societies. The main culture clash, if you like, was between the Hausa Fulanis of the north and the two major ethnic groups of the south. Prior to the colonial era, ancient Yoruba kingdoms such as the Oyo Empire had for many years suffered under several waves of jihadi attacks by the Islamic Sokoto Caliphate of the north, led by the famous Sultan Uthman Dan Fodio. Now, although the Igbos did not have a similar history of warring with the Hausa Fulani, the British colonial enterprise would create the perfect environment for the sharp differences between these two tribes to be brought to the forefront. In 1914, British High Commissioner Frederick Lugard effectively created the country we know today as Nigeria by bringing the northern and southern regions together in the now infamous Nigerian Amalgamation of 1914. Till this very day, the feeling amongst many Yoruba and Igbo historians is that one of the main purposes of this amalgamation was to place the more affluent South under the control of the autocratic North. The theory goes that by joining the more educated and therefore less controllable southern region to the much larger northern region, The British government was better able to implement its policy of indirect rule, as the amalgamation essentially gave dominion over the entire country to the northern elites, who were significantly less rebellious and generally more amenable to British interests. It is also worth noting that from 1914 onwards, the British adopted a practice of placing northerners in key leadership positions within the colonial administration. Despite being generally better educated, Southerners were more often than not limited to managerial and executive roles within the colonial apparatus. When the struggle for Nigeria's independence began to take shape, it was mainly Yoruba and Igbo intellectuals such as the political activist Fumi Ransom Kuti and the renowned jurist Jaja Wachukwu that led the fight for Nigeria's sovereignty. According to some historians, many of the northern elites were not at all welcoming to the idea of an independent Nigeria, as they feared that independence would mean losing the privileged positions that they had enjoyed under the colonial structure. The story goes that as a condition for them agreeing to support the push for Nigeria's independence, the northern leadership specifically demanded that the new nation maintain its colonial political structure. And even though it pretty much guaranteed a continuation of the North's dominance, the Igbo and Yoruba leaders, in their desperation to gain independence at all costs, agreed to the North's demands. And so upon its independence on the 1st of October 1960, the Nigerian state was divided into 3 geopolitical regions, in which a disproportionately large northern region was united with 2 smaller eastern and western regions. Nigeria's British-style parliamentary government was led by its first and only Prime Minister, Alhaji Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, the northern co-founder of his political party, the Northern People's Congress. Tafawa Balewa's NPC party governed in coalition with the Igbo-aligned National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, which was led by Nigeria's Governor-General, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, the man who would later go on to serve as the ceremonial president of the First Nigerian Republic, which was established in 1963. The Yoruba-aligned Action Group Party, which was headed by Chief Obafemi Awolowo, played the opposition role. If unity was the goal, then the Nigerian state had gotten off to a very bad start. Nigeria's parliamentary system was a bit of a farce, as Nigeria's 3 main parties were not built around ideology, but on ethnic nationalism. With the vast majority of Nigeria's general population still largely unfamiliar with the Western-style democratic system of their new country, pretty much everyone voted based on ethnicity. The Southwesterners voted for the AG, the Southeasterners for the NCNC, and the Northerners for the NPC. And as the northern region was by far the largest constituency, the NPC was basically guaranteed control over Nigeria, as none of the other 2 parties could compete with the NPC's large northern voting base. As you can imagine, it was only a matter of time before the shoddy foundations on which the Nigerian state had been built began to show serious signs of strain.
That is a broad overview of the story from the creation of Nigeria 1900 up until independence in 1960. But there's a vital detail that's missing in the context of the Igbo-Yoruba relationship. That is something that happened on April Fool's Day, 1939. 1st of April, 1939. That is a key date that lies at the root of the rivalry that we've seen between the East and the West. What happened? Well, it was this. The then British governor of Nigeria, Bernard Bodilon, divided what was one southern Nigeria, which had been playing against one northern Nigeria, 1 against 1. He divided without invitation, without solicitation, without any troubles between the East and the West. He divided southern Nigeria into effectively 2 halves. The eastern half, predominantly Igbo, and the western half, predominantly Yoruba. Similar to what they later did in India, when they divided what had been British India into majority Hindu India and majority Muslim Pakistan. That was the exact same thing that was done. And that was the genesis, the beginning of the political rivalry, as you now had the two halves that could then be played off against one another. And the countdown to independence started in 1941, in the middle of their Second World War. The background to that was the negotiations, if I could use that term, between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. It was the price that Roosevelt, the US president, extracted from Britain as a condition of America entering the Second World War on the side of Britain and its allies, that the empire had to go. So the process of unwinding the empire started with the Atlantic Charter in August 1941. And all the events that took place thereafter in the Nigeria political space need to be understood in the context of that process of unwinding the empire. Bear in mind that it's not something that the British wanted to do. It is something that they had to do. But being experienced strategists, they were going to do it in a way that preserved as much as possible what they had. And this is critical to the understanding of the political events which then followed. The first stage, as it concerned the evolution to democracy stroke independence, was the Richards Constitution, which formalized the three regions, North, East, and West, without a central parliament at this stage, because the British colonials were still running the show. So you had Eastern region, Western region, Northern region. That was 1st of January 1946. We then moved forward to a date, a very key date, 1951. This was the date of the launch of the Action Group as the political vehicle for the West. And this was the speech, listen to the words very carefully. This was the speech that Obafemi Awolowo, the then leader of the Action Group, delivered on the occasion of the launch of that political party. It speaks to the issues of the moment.
Our enemies and detractors are already at work. They are seeking to dwarf our stature in order to delude the public that they are taller than we are. They are also seeking to divert us from our noble and constructive course into the barren land of petty strife and fruitless controversy. I believe I am voicing your sentiments when I say that we do not grudge other parties their professed popularity and excellence. But it is mean and cowardly, and evidence of weakness and utter demerit for any group of people to attempt to commend themselves to the public by the negative process of belittling and condemning others. Strong, courageous, resourceful, and self-confident people are never afraid of rivals or competitors. It is not an easy matter to resist the temptation of being dragged down the drains of bitter recriminations and press war. But if we are to attain our objectives, we must resolve to pursue our course unflinchingly, without paying the slightest heed to the envious and the asses that bray.
without paying attention to the envious and the asses that bray, and I would add on social media, because this is what we saw and witnessed in the course of last year's elections. Asses on both sides of the River Niger, both banks, braying on social media, ignorantly, totally devoid of understanding of what they were doing, because they were competing for the privilege of that one seat in the center in a winner takes all arrangement. Some people were saying, how can you be doing Igbo and Yoruba conference in the light of what happened last year? Well, the explanation is very simple. Those ones that you were hearing are the ones who are competing for the one seat that one Nigeria offers. They're not the ones speaking the language of cooperation, of collaboration, of sharing, of equity. It's winner takes all. And in a winner takes all situation, of course, the Igbo then represent an existential threat to Yoruba interests, and vice versa. The Yoruba represent an existential threat to Igbo interests. But let's carry on. We now move to the next key date, which is 29th of June 1951. This is when the Macpherson Constitution creates the federal parliament. By the way, do bear in mind, all these constitutions that you're hearing, they'll have the common denominator that these were not the works of the Nigerian people. These were the work of the British colonial officers who had their own agenda that they were serving in the process of shaping the constitutional arrangement. And 29th of June 1952 was the very first sitting of the new House of Representatives. Now you can imagine the shock to the British agenda when on the 31st of March 1953, out of the blue, the Action Group, Awolowo's party, moves a private motion for independence of Nigeria in 1956. That party had been formed with the specific and explicit agenda of pushing the British out of Nigeria's affairs. And there they present a motion for Nigeria's independence on our terms with effect from 1956. So of course, the British weren't going to have that. What they managed to engineer was a delay of the timetable by the introduction of an amending motion. What we got in 1956 was far from independence. It was a visit from Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II. Nevertheless, the die had been cast. The timetable, the pressure for independence had now been accelerated. And what then happened was that on 1st of October 1954, the Littleton Constitution was introduced. Again, note, it is made by the British. Yes, they will have had drawn in some, some agreeable Nigerians to sit round the table with them, but this was not the work of our people or the peoples of Nigeria. So 1954, 1st of October, was the Littleton Constitution, which allowed for self-government for those regions that wanted it, starting in 1957. So instead of independence in 1956, what we were going to be allowed for those of the free regions who wanted it was self-governance from 1957. 1957. Now, here comes the next key date, and a very important one for us to factor in. We lose sight of it. Today is the 15th of January 2024, but a major event occurred on the 15th of January 1956. This was the announcement by the British colonial powers that they had discovered oil in Nigeria. That announcement was on the 15th of January 1956. Now, you'll come to understand by the end of this program why the 15th of January is such a critical date in Nigeria's history. So here was their announcement. Now, of course, we've explained that they had actually found the oil much earlier than that. They had found the oil in 1908, and they were producing 2,000 barrels a day by 1909. So your guess is as good as mine as to what was happening to that oil between 1908 and their confession now, just as we're preparing for independence. And just think about the impact of that announcement in 1956 on the political configurations and calculations as independence was now just a few years around the corner. So 15th of January 1956 was the announcement of the discovery of oil. Then we move forward to independence, 1st of October 1960. And within just 2 years, in fact, less than 2 years, because on the 29th of May 1962, there was a declaration of a state of emergency in the Western region, which effectively shut down the self-government that the regions were enjoying as far as the Western region was concerned. That was 29th of May 1962, less than 2 years into the experiment with a parliamentary system of government. The next key date is October 1965. That is when regional assembly elections took place. And as it concerned the Western region, it led to what I can only describe as a minor civil war. It's popularly known as Operation Wetia. And that continued from the end of those elections in October 1965 until when? Now, this is a key detail that people miss when they're looking at the history of Nigeria. It continued until the next key 15th of January landmark, which is 15th of January 1966, which is popularly associated with what is called the Igbo coup. 15th of January 1966, because with that coup, clearly a state of emergency across the country, martial law was declared, and that shut down the civil crisis in the Western region. Now, many of my people do not want to acknowledge that, but unfortunately, the evidence is the evidence, and the facts are the facts, that the consequence of what has been labeled the Igbo coup was the shutting down and the putting out of the conflagration that had consumed or was consuming the Western region at that time. So the end of Western region's tribulations is actually the beginning of the Eastern region's troubles, precisely because the coup was labeled an Igbo coup. It needs to be reevaluated. The next key date was the 29th of July 1966, which was the counter coup, and Biafra is then declared on the 29th of May. Popular accounts say 30th of May, but I think it was 2 a.m. on the 29th of May is when Biafra was declared. And then the shooting war, the war proper, starts on the 6th of July, 1967. At this point, we want to take you to a passage from a book. It was a discussion in September 1967, in the midst of the war, a discussion between the leading Biafran officers. Listen, again, in the context of the Igbo-Yoruba relationship that we're addressing, listen to this passage.
It cannot be denied that the present conflict is, in parts, the product of historical factors. Only against this background will the dialectics of the conflicts, of which the Biafra-Nigerian struggle forms part, become comprehensible. In order to safeguard their permanent interests, the British deliberately built an element of instability into the political structure that they grouped disparate peoples under the name of Nigeria. The ever-recurring struggles for survival among the different ethnic groups that followed the wake of British withdrawal clearly revealed one constant factor. In essence, the struggle has been an ideological one, in which the progressives of different shades have ranged themselves against the reactionary and feudal clique. The dividing line between the two rival alliances is also geographical. While the reactionaries are mainly to be found in the north, the progressives are grouped together in the south. It did not, however, mean that there were no progressives in the north and vice versa. The semblance of peace and stability prevailed in Nigeria only to the extent of political equilibrium existing at any given time between the two opposing alliances. This equilibrium was constantly endangered by the unequal weight exerted on it by the northern reactionary oligarchy, which enjoyed certain advantages over its southern rival. For a number of reasons, the progressives of the South lacked effective cohesion. The reactionaries, by contrast, were a powerful monolith, which, profiting from the nature of the constitution imposed on the country, were able from time to time to exploit to advantage the divisions within the ranks of the Southern Alliance. Whenever the feudal oligarchy was able to isolate or win over, for example, the eastern wing of the Southern Alliance from the western branch, it was nearly always able to crush either of the branches which tried to resist single-handedly the selfish and unprogressive policies of the North. For the Southern Alliance to survive, it was always absolutely necessary for its two wings, Eastern and Western Nigeria, to act in unison against the feudal and oppressive yoke of the North. That Biafra, i.e. Eastern Nigeria, found itself alone in the current crisis is a historical accident. Had a similar crisis occurred a year or so earlier, it is conceivable that Biafra might have swapped positions with Western Nigeria. This is not to gloss over the facts that the northern attitude to the personal traits and qualities of the Igbo man has given this crisis its peculiar virulence in terms of the human tragedy that has accompanied it. From the foregoing analysis, it ought to be obvious that the eastern branch of the Southern Alliance, now Biafra, could not successfully hold its ground against the North without the active support of the other branch of the alliance. Its task has been made the more arduous by the fact that the North has not only won the reluctant support of Western Nigeria through military coercion, but also in receiving massive scale military assistance from the two superpower, Britain and USSR.
But it's worth repeating this key passage here. For the Southern Alliance to survive, it was always absolutely necessary for its two wings, Eastern and Western Nigeria, to act in unison against the feudal and oppressive yoke of the North. That Biafra, i.e. Eastern Nigeria, found itself alone in the current crisis is a historical accident. Had a similar crisis occurred a year or so earlier, it is conceivable that Biafra might have swapped position with Western Nigeria. That is a reference back to Wetia, the crisis that was going on in the Western region. It's very important that leaders of thought on both banks of the River Niger understand these things. As is said, this is not to gloss over the fact that the northern attitude to the personal traits and qualities of the Igbo man has given this crisis its peculiar virulence in terms of the human tragedy that has accompanied it. That was September 1967. Our next key date is the end of the war, and it brings us again to the 15th of January. The war ends on the 15th of January 1970. Now, I don't believe in coincidences. Recall earlier, the first key 15th of January date was the announcement of the discovery of oil in Nigeria, 15th of January 1956. 15th of January 1966 is that first military coup that ends the crisis in the Western region, Operation Wetia, and which is labeled the Igbo coup and marks the beginning of the tribulations for the eastern half of the Southern Alliance. And then the war follows, and it comes to a perfect cyclical end on the 15th of January 1970. Now here we are, 15th of January 2024, and the words of Obafemi Awolowo still ring true, where he said, "It is not an easy matter to resist the temptation of being dragged down the drains of bitter recrimination and press war. But if we are to attain our objectives, we must resolve to pursue our course unflinchingly, without paying the slightest heed to the envious and the asses that bray on social media." That is the commitment of the Fatherland Group. That is the reason why we organize this annual event, whereby we improve our understanding of the Nigeria story with a view to improving and enhancing the relationship that was so deliberately fractured on April Fool's Day 1939, which fracture continues to handicap the rest of Nigeria. And it is why Fatherland Group has proposed the Orange Union as the way forward, a union in which every segment of the Orange is an ethnic group, each of equal value to the other, regardless of size, regardless of population, regardless of geographical space. And together, as we were before the colonial intrusion that imposed one group on top of all the others, we were good neighbors. That is our destination. And that is where we will end up. It's only a matter of time.